So this is what we're making. Oval shaped wire, hammered finish with a little pattern. So I'm going to make a bangle to match the ring, and I'm going to start with about a 195 millimeter long piece of 3 millimeter round wire. Now, the bangle that I'm making, the metal will eventually have to be 210 millimeters long, and we'll get that length by hammering like we did the ring. This needs to be annealed. We check to make sure it really is 195. It's about 200, but that's okay because I can always cut it to length after I hammer it. So the first thing we're going to do is just hammer this until it's half the thickness, and I'm using the slightly rounded side of a planishing hammer, and you always want your planishing hammer to be smooth and shiny and no marks in it, because whatever mark it leaves on the metal will then be nice and smooth and shiny with no marks. So I'm just going to use my lap block again, and we want as smooth a piece of metal to hammer on as possible, because that way this side that is opposite where we're hammering will also be smooth. If your bench block is rough, the metal on that side will be rough. Now this metal is half hard, so I won't need to anneal it, and we'll just start hammering. So try to get the same thickness and the same width as you're hammering. And as you're hammering, if the metal starts to curve, like this has a slight curve in it, then you hammer a little bit more on the other side and it'll straighten that curve out. Now, one of the reasons I'm hammering this is to show you how to do it without a rolling mill. With a rolling mill, you could just roll it through, but you wouldn't have this nice little pattern on the edge if you did. So, and I quite like that pattern, which is why I'm hammering it. And you can check from time to time to make sure the thickness is right. So this is 195, so I can hammer it a little bit more. It doesn't have to be half the thickness, but it's just an easy thing to do. Now 3 millimeters, I don't know what the gauge is, because I'm always having people ask me, what gauge is that? Well, in Tim McCrate's book, The Complete Metalsmith, in the very back, he has a chart. And 3.25 millimeters is 8 gauge, and 2.9 millimeters is 9, so it'd be about 7.5. Anyway, this is quite handy. If you don't have one of Tim's books, You can look online for a conversion chart. So when you have your metal hammered, you'll notice that we have these nice smooth shiny facets where we've been hammering. But if you look at the back, if your block is smooth, it will also be faceted and shiny. But we are going to use this side for the outside. Now, it's still, it's definitely work hardened, but it's still bendable. So we need 210 millimeters, and you can see it's grown that much since we started hammering it. So I just use my texture to mark it, and then we'll saw and file. I'm going to saw on the outside of the mark so that I can file back to it. Now I'm going to file using my Swiss number 2 cut flat hand file. And check using the safe edge of your file to make sure that it really is flat. Do both ends. Lovely. Now I need to anneal this before I even think about trying to bend it, because it's so work hardened. So I'm just going to heat this until it's a dull red. Now I have a pumice pan that I use for annealing, and the pumice, because it tends to reflect the heat back. So I'll just start at this end, bring it up to a dull red. Usually you want to turn off any fluorescent lights because it tends to blank out the red. Now, if you can see red at all, like that, move down the line. And you can move your torch so that it tends to heat down the length. Finished. So now quench it in water and dry it. So now our piece is nice and malleable. That just means soft and easy to work. And if you can bend it and it stays bent, it's annealed. Now, I almost always hallmark my piece now. just a little quirk of mine. And you should be able to just bend this with your fingers. You could use your flat half-round pliers if you want. So we're just going to manipulate this until the two ends hold themselves together and they're nice and perfect as we can get them, and then we'll solder. So I have my join down against my charcoal block. And I put a little bit of tension down so that the two ends are nice and level. And then we mix up your flux, make sure it's a creamy white. And then I'm going to use a 2mm long piece of hard solder. Cut an extra piece just because I might need it. Now I'm using a number 7 tip on my Smith's Little Torch, and I've got it cranked up, but it is still a neutral flame, as you can see. You just bring it back with the oxygen until the orange goes out, and that's neutral. So we just warm this up. The flux will go dry and be kind of a pasty white. And I'm just brushing the flame back and forth on the join. The flux will go clear, like that, and then the solder will flow. And so there. And if there's not quite enough solder, you can pick up the piece that you have on your block and that's lovely. And I go to the sides to make sure that the solder is gone all the way through, and then on the other side. Great. So quench it in water and pickle. And you really don't look at your solder join until after you've pickled, because it's almost impossible to see it well until you get the flux out of the way. So once you're out of the pickle, dry off the metal, have a look at your solder join, make sure it's good. If everything looks good, we'll round it up on the bracelet mandrel using the rawhide hammer. And then we'll tidy up our join using 400 grade wet or dry sandpaper on a sanding stick. And you need to sand until there's no solder visible. So when you do it correctly, there will be the tiniest solder line that you can see. And the reason you want to get all of the solder off is that solder is a different alloy, and it will oxidize at a different rate to the rest of your bracelet. So if you don't get all of the solder off, you'll have a dark spot when it starts to oxidize. So once you have the outside done correctly, I use the split mandrel on my handpiece. Tidy up the inside and then the edges. Lovely. So now what I'm going to do is put the stamp mark in to match the ring. You wouldn't have to if you were just making a bangle, but because I'm matching the ring to, I'm matching the bracelet to the ring. So just go back on your bracelet mandrel, put your marks in. I'm putting these marks about 25 millimeters apart. Doesn't have to be perfect. So you can see the marks. You can put any pattern in you want, or none at all. It doesn't really matter. But now what I'm going to do is just take my jeweler's hammer, which is shaped like a small planishing hammer, slightly rounded, and I'm going to do the edge. You can see where I'm putting a little hammered finish on. I'll do both edges. So we'll flip that over, do the other edge. And in the middle. So you can see what it's going to look like. Now it's just a matter of polishing it. And if you polish it on a wheel, you'll take some of these facets off. And if you polish it in the tumbler, the facets will stay nice and crisp. It's up to you. But now's the time to polish it. So there we are at the tumbler. Nice and shiny.